Hello, everyone, and welcome to Virtual Heart Week. My name is Stacy Bowe, and I am the Training Program Manager at the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, and I will be hosting today's session. HEART stands for Heritage Emergency and Response Training, which is a program developed through the partnership of the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative and the Heritage Emergency National Task Force. Normally, we host HEART at the Smithsonian Institution in person in Washington, D.C., but due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, we decided to switch gears and have developed a week of informative online programming dedicated to increasing the understanding of emergencies and disasters that affect cultural institutions and historic sites. Though we are unable to train in person, we are so glad to continue fulfilling the mission of HEART through this program and provide an opportunity for all in the cultural, academic, and emergency management fields to better understand each other and the intersections within those fields. Again, I am host feature Samantha Montano, assistant professor at its Maritime Academy. The title of her presentation is called Using Volunteers in Times of Disaster. Dr. Montano is currently an assistant professor of emergency management at Massachusetts Maritime Academy, and she has taught courses on disaster preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation, vulnerable populations in disaster, the political and legal foundations, disaster communications, and voluntary organizations active in disaster. Her research interests cut across areas of interest to emergency management. She primarily studies nonprofits, volunteerism, and informal aid efforts in a disaster, but also does work related to the intersection of disasters and climate change, gender, and media. Dr. Montano is also the author of Disasterology, Dispatches from the Front Lines of the Climate Crisis, as well as the co-founder of the Center for Climate Adaptation Research. We're so glad to have her today. Before we begin, just a note that this webinar is being recorded for future use and a live transcript is available. You can enable that at the bottom of your screen. Again, this is a Zoom webinar, so you'll notice that everyone's mics are muted and cameras are turned off. But if you would like to ask a question, the Q&A feature allows you to submit questions, which we will answer at the end of the session. And now I will hand this over to our speaker.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here today. Let me just share my screen real quick and we can get started. So like Stacy said, my name's Samantha. I am a disaster researcher and my primary focus is in nonprofits and volunteers in times of disaster. So hopefully today we can kind of talk through some different frameworks for thinking about volunteers and disasters, which hopefully you all will be able to use in the context of your own cultural institutions to see kind of what opportunities there may be to better utilize volunteers in the work that you're doing. So before we jump into some of these frameworks, I wanted to just give you a little bit more of a sense of my background here so you have a good idea of where I'm coming from in terms of how I think about volunteers, how I think about how they can be used as it relates to disasters. So I actually got my start doing disaster work as a volunteer. I went down to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina and levee failure in 2005. I just went like a week-long high school spring type trip, and we were gutting houses and to rebuild houses. And while I was there, I really struck by how the vast majority of people that were out in the neighborhoods actually doing the like hands-on work of actually fixing homes were New Orleans and the survivors disaster themselves, and then secondary nonprofits and volunteers, people like me that had come from all over the world to volunteer their time to help people build their lives. And so I ended up moving to New Orleans. I lived there for many years, working on disaster recovery, worked with a whole bunch of different nonprofits throughout the city of New Orleans that were doing recovery work. I was a volunteer with one of those organizations and actually kind of worked my way up into doing volunteer coordinating, volunteer managing type work. So I know I'm talking with Stacy earlier that some of you want to use volunteers, but are worried about how time intensive that can be. And I definitely understand that from personal experience. And so I continue to work with various nonprofits while I lived in New Orleans. The BP oil disaster happened, so expanded our work down coast, went to Joplin, Missouri, after a tornado, some other smaller disasters around the country. And that really led me in doing research and specifically wanting to do research on volunteers and nonprofits. One thing that I saw as I went disaster to disaster, although they were extremely in a different situations, Joplin versus Katrina, I saw that every time a disaster happened, we almost kind of reinvented the wheel with how we were thinking about particularly the recovery process and kind of reinventing the wheel of how we were going to be able to use profit, to use volunteers. And so that led me to graduate school where I got my doctorate in emergency management and had the opportunity to see volunteers and nonprofits, most along the Gulf Coast in response to flooding in Louisiana and in Texas, and just start to kind of build our knowledge about these volunteers and kind of take a more empirical approach to understanding how operating in times of disaster. So, not to throw a model at you first off here, but I want to kind of start by taking a super, super big picture view of how we do emergency management in the United States. We use what's called a limited intervention model, and this is really important for thinking about what the purpose of volunteer is during times of disasters. So, the system that we have created in the United States is one that intentionally has limited involvement government in how they are involved in the response and recovery from events. So when a disaster happens, you have this big circle here of all of these needs that a community has. And some of those needs, everything from housing to getting new jobs, to evacuating, to getting food and water after a disaster, all of those needs make up this big circle here. Some of those needs are going to be able to be addressed by the individuals themselves, the survivors of that event themselves. They'll be able to use their individual resources. They will not be able to address all of their needs. If they are, then it's a disaster. So we know there's always going to be these leftover needs. Government's going to do some things. They're going to provide some funding. Most of that funding is going to go towards these public assistance, kind of broad infrastructure type projects, rather than to individuals and to nonprofits that may have been affected by the disaster, which means we have a lot of unmet needs that are going to be left over. And using this model that we have, the plan is that the nonprofit sector is going to meet the rest of those unmet needs. And so sometimes when we see a lot of volunteers involved after a disaster, there can sometimes be the perception that government has failed or that something has gone wrong and therefore people are having to volunteer. In reality, the way our system is designed is based on this expectation that people will volunteer and that those volunteers are much a part of our emergency management system as somebody who works with FEMA. I'm trying to recognize this important volunteers. Here, as an emergency man and even FEMA call disaster volunteers the backbone of our emergency management system. So sometimes we treat these volunteers as kind of being extra, but really they're built into the design of how we approach emergency management. So this is the disaster life cycle. You may be familiar with this, maybe seen this in other presentations, I'm not sure, but I want to walk through it because I think this is a great starting point for thinking about some of the different kind of specific ways that you might be able to use volunteers in your institution. So when we talk about disasters, when we talk about emergency management, most of us are going to think of the actual moment the disaster happened, the actual impact when that disaster occurs. And what we're mostly thinking of there is what we call the phase of response. So this is where the disaster has actually happened, you're doing things to save lives, property, environment. It's, what CNN has 24/7 coverage, you're getting the alerts on your phone. Flashing lights, it's what they play in the disaster movies. This phase of response captures the vast majority of our attention when it comes to disaster. Again, it's usually kind of what we think about first, but in reality, response is almost always a very short period of time. It's usually only about 72 hours, sometimes a week or two, where you're actually doing things to save lives and property. Most of the actual work related to disasters comes before or after the actual response. So you have recovery. This is where we're actually rebuilding everything, restoring, putting things back together. You'll hear folks kind of distinguish recovery between short term, where you're just really doing the kind of basic restoration type work, just to get lights turned back on as quickly as possible, that type of work, versus the longer term recovery, which is actually rebuilding, potentially making changes to what was impacted. And that can take much, much longer. When we think about recovery, unless you've really been through a disaster yourself, we tend to not have a great perception of how complicated and difficult and long recovery actually takes. When we're thinking about recovery from Katrina, for example, we're 15 plus years past, and there are still people who would say that they're going through recovery. They're still working on rebuilding their home or be able to finance coming back to the city full time. So, we're talking about 5 years, 10 years plus for some of these larger events. So this is something where, volunteers particularly important, especially into the long term. Unfortunately, we tend to see the most volunteers helping during response, because that's when they are aware that help is needed. That's where there's media coverage. They're able to kind of be aware that help is actually needed. Whereas in recovery, we see there's a much greater need usually for volunteers. But anybody who has worked long on a recovery will you see a big quick drop off on those volunteers. A couple days, couple weeks after the disaster has actually happened. And then in terms of what volunteers are actually doing during recovery, again, it kind of anything you can imagine related to that recovery. There are people who are volunteering their time to it. So, rebuilding people's homes, helping organizations, other nonprofits get back up on feet if they've affected, helping individual survivors, kind of whatever needs to happen in the community, you can find people actually working on. I'm not sure if the video went off.
Yeah, nope. Go ahead and continue. We're having a little bit of audio issues. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
But yep, you're good. Thank you. Sorry, everybody.
That's okay. So then so response, and then we have recovery afterwards, and then also have mitigation and preparedness, which ideally are happening before disaster occurs. So preparedness is where we're doing things to ready ourselves for response and recovery. Traditionally, when we think about preparedness, we usually just think about preparing for the actual response. So when we write plans, when we do trainings, when we do exercises, these really kind of traditional preparedness measures, typically we're thinking about doing those things in terms of actually saving lives and property during that phase of response. But holistic preparedness here would include how we're preparing for recovery as well. So are we, setting aside our savings, day funds? How are we really preparing ourselves, our institutions, our communities for actually going through that really complex recovery process? And then finally, we have mitigation, which I would argue is kind of the most important, although often forgotten. This is where we're doing to actually prevent or reduce the impact of an event long before it happens. So these are in kind of a broader traditional sense, building levees, if you build a flood wall, if you raise your house or your building up above floodplain, kind of the generally more structural changes that you may make to a building or to a community to try and minimize the actual extent of damage that may be caused in the event of a hazard occurring. And so when we think, again, about preparedness and mitigation, we see that volunteers are present here as well. So you have volunteers that are helping with planning. Some of the very best planning that a community can do incorporates other nonprofit, incorporate other voluntary organizations who use volunteers, are integrating those into the community broader fairness plan. Also see volunteers helping with mitigation. Kind of a popular one to volunteers for here are things like wetland restoration, and the other kind of more natural approaches to mitigation are kind of rife for volunteers to be involved. This is where we see a lot of political activism. A lot of that is through volunteers advocating for policy change, trying to do things like change local building codes or certain policies that will make the community safer from future events. So throughout the disaster life cycle, you can see how volunteers are used constantly, not only during the risk. So there's a really kind of broad set of tasks that there's potential for volunteers to be engaged with. I also wanted to just kind of make a quick point here that, again, although there can sometimes understandably be a little bit of hesitancy about using volunteers, all of our stakeholder groups in emergency management do use volunteers, at least in some way. So government uses volunteers, or like pseudo volunteers through programs like AmeriCorps. They also help fund and oversee the program across the country, which are citizen-based response teams where FEMA and their local agencies offer formalized trainings for anybody in the community who wants to volunteer their time to help during response. Businesses oftentimes will use their employees as volunteers. We see a lot of corporate volunteerism, especially during recovery on like big rebuild days. The local branch of the bank will send their staff out for the day to go help run a shelter or whatever the case is. And then, of course, we see nonprofits using volunteers persistently to do all of the work that they're doing day to day and during moments of crisis as well. So there, again, want to kind of give you an idea of kind of the scale at which volunteers are being used here and the scope of which they're being used. So I want to talk more for the rest of our time here, kind of more specifically about how your cultural institution could use volunteers effectively as you're thinking about this in the context of disaster. I have the sense that you all are coming from kind of very different institutions in terms of size and location and risk and resources. And so I've tried to keep this relatively general so that it's applicable to any of you. During the Q&A, I'm happy to kind of talk through some of these more specifically. So the first thing that I would really recommend doing is kind of a self-analysis using an emergency management framework as you do it, just to start thinking about for your particular institution where there could be room for using volunteers and how that can match up with the specific needs that your institution has. So I would start by going through each of those phases of disaster, going through mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery, and think about what your institution is working on in each of those phases. So if you're, presumably you already have some form of planning process that is ongoing, or you're doing some kind of trainings to prepare for flooding, for example. So if you're already doing that, where is there room for volunteers to be assisting with that? If you are starting to think about the need to put up some kind of flood wall near your institution, and you're thinking about how are we going to pay for that? Where would we get funding for that? Is there a way for you to use volunteers to help advocate for that specific project that you're needing to work on? If you are someplace where you do experience flooding regularly, and you are having to respond to events kind of frequently, and where could you train a set of people who are volunteers who you know you're going to rely on regularly to incorporate them into that response? And then as you are hopefully also planning ahead for the recovery, not just the response, thinking about how you can use volunteers in the longer term as you are going through a recovery process, depending on, kind of what that process looks like. So really kind of spending some time just thinking through each of these phases, thinking through what this looks like for your particular institution. Another question I would look at here is, how is each of these phases or the tasks that you may need to do for your institution look different hazard to hazard? So probably most of us are thinking about disasters right now more in the frame of reference of the pandemic, just because that is the thing we are all experiencing and have been experiencing. But the pandemic does look quite different than many of the other hazards that you may experience. So thinking through everything from, natural hazards like flooding or earthquakes to things that are related to cybersecurity or more man-made type hazards that could affect your institution. All of those types of hazards are very different from one another, but they are all still falling under this purview of emergency management, falling within this idea of actually using disaster volunteers. And you can work through those different hazards still using those same phases, kind of regardless of what hazard is. Those 4 phases are still the ones that you're going to need to work through. And again, that's going to look very different depending on your institution. Obviously, having gone through some kind of risk assessment to identify which hazards you're most at risk from and prioritize those. I'd also just offer here too that it is a really good idea to think about how this will change over time. So if you are an institution that is located along the coast, for example, you may be looking at the reality of already or about to be dealing with sea level rise and more persistent flooding rather than these kind of one-off events. So just think through too how things like climate change or other changes that are happening in your community may alter those hazards that you experience, or may kind of alter that risk assessment that you're doing in terms of thinking through which are the most likely to occur. And particularly think about how the frequency of disasters that you experience may change the strain felt by your institution. So most institutions or most organizations, if they experience one disaster and it's a relatively quick shock, they're able to access resources to come back from that event. They're able to go through that recovery process. It's still a difficult experience, but they are able to get through that process. However, if you are an institution that is experiencing these persistent disasters, if you are located along the Texas coast or the Louisiana coast, or you're someplace where you're having to deal with persistent flooding from sea level rise, that kind of capacity of your institution to be able to respond to those events may shift. And I think that's a place where volunteers can be particularly useful, because you can kind of build a better rapport with them over a long term. You probably have a greater need as an institution for those volunteers. So really thinking of this kind of temporal component, I think it is really important. And then also I would just do kind of, as you're doing your other emergency management related planning, et cetera, are there places where you're kind of falling short? What are your needs as an institution related broadly to emergency management? And then is it possible to find volunteers to meet those needs? So I would not necessarily approach this of, we have volunteers, how can we apply them to our disaster work? But rather, here's our disaster work, where are needs emerging from this? And does that fit with our ability to use volunteers? So in terms of actually managing volunteers, again, this is going to look very different depending on how your institution is wanting to use volunteers. So I've broken it down into these three kind of broad categories, which is how I usually think about volunteer management. So we have volunteer recruitment, volunteer engagement, and then volunteer retainment. So in terms of recruitment, I would start with, who do you already have volunteering? I assume many of your institutions already use volunteers in various capacities. And I would almost say it's probably a really great idea to try and use those volunteers in the disaster context. One, this is going to save you time of having to go and find more volunteers. It's going to give kind of your existing volunteers more things for them to do. It's also going to kind of solidify to them that you trust them and are kind of trusting them to be involved with this kind of more serious tasks that you as an institution are needing to address. And so I would, I guess, depending on the size and structure of your institution, be reaching out to whoever manages those volunteers just on a day-to-day non-disaster context, and seeing if there are ways to kind of build a bridge there and use them for this purpose. Other questions that you want to be thinking. So if you are needing to recruit new volunteers to work on these disaster related tasks, you want to be thinking about kind of who you want to be recruiting. Is this something that students could be doing? Is this something you could offer an internship for? Is there, people who are retired? Are they a group to potentially be able to address these needs that you have? But really be thinking about this like time and resource component. That's one of the stumbling blocks that a lot of disaster organizations have when we get disaster recovery, is being able to find people who have a substantial amount of time to be able to dedicate for this. I also, again, depending on which tasks you're wanting volunteers to engage in, really think ahead and plan out what kinds of skills they need to have in order to do the task you're asking them to do. So is this a skill that they need to already have? Do they need to have some particular background, some are kind of pre-existing education that they're coming to you with already? Or is this a skill that you're able to teach them and train them? And then also thinking about people that already have previous volunteer experience. So again, depending on what you're looking for these volunteers to do, there may be some real benefit here to looking at some of the national disaster nonprofits, groups like Team Rubicon, or groups like the Red Cross would be an obvious one here. Groups that already have volunteers that work during times of disasters, and seeing if there is a possibility of you kind of using their volunteers when you have a specific need. So kind of reaching out to those other kind of pre-existing groups that have that disaster expertise. In terms of volunteer engagement, this is probably the majority of what you would spend your time doing. So one of the most important things we know from research, and anybody who has done volunteer coordinating will know this, is really good volunteer communication, really making sure that volunteers are clear about what it is that you want them to do, why they are having to do these things, how it fits into the broader picture of the disaster and or your institution. Offering volunteer training. So if there are specific skills or something that they need to have, making sure that they have those training opportunities. And really making sure that you are assigning them regular tasks. So one of the big pitfalls that I see with organizations that are working on disaster related tasks is that they will pull together a group of volunteers, usually pretty soon after a major disaster has happened, and everybody will be really on board. They'll be coming to meetings, they'll be sending emails around to everybody. They'll be really excited about being a part of this group and planning for that next disaster. They'll have lots of great ideas, a lot of big lofty goals for what the group can do. And then over time, if a disaster doesn't happen, which is obviously a good, but if that disaster doesn't happen within another year or so, that group starts to usually kind of fall apart. And it's largely because they don't really have anything to do, right? They've kind of written out their plan that they have, and then it just kind of sits there and people move on to other things. That adrenaline rush that they have from responding to that initial disaster fades away. They get busy with other things, and the group kind of just falls apart. And that is always kind of unfortunate, right? Because you've had a lot of people who are really engaged. You've put resources and time into developing that group, and you probably really need that group if that next disaster happens. And so having that group in and of itself is part of your preparedness. And so one of the ways that you can combat that kind of loss of interest, that lack of engagement as you go into the long term, is to find reasons for people to be meeting and to find kind of regular tasks for people to do. I think in the context of where you all work, this idea of using the people who are already volunteering with you can really help combat this lack of engagement that you can see during non-disaster times, because they'll have these other day-to-day tasks that they can go and do, but still have that opportunity for training and still be ready to respond if a disaster were to happen. And then, of course, there's this issue of volunteer coordination. So you need to be thinking about coordinating volunteers, not only during the response to an event, but again, across all of those phases. If you're going to use a group of volunteers to help advocate for some kind of funding for a mitigation project, for example, that's going to require somebody to coordinate those efforts. And again, that can be a time-consuming process. So really thinking through kind of who's going to be responsible for that, what resources they need in order to be successful in doing that. And then finally, we have volunteer retainment. So again, this issue of really trying to help keep people engaged in that long term, having tangible evidence for them of their helpfulness and really kind of demonstrating to them how the work that they've done is meaningful and has helped the institution is really important. I think also managing volunteer expectations is really important. If you start a group and you say, you guys are the disaster volunteers, people are probably going to have kind of a perception that they're going to be running into the burning building. And that is probably not necessarily how you're planning on using these volunteers. And so just being really clear with them about kind of what it is that you expect they'll be doing, what you expect they will not be doing, and just making sure everybody is kind of on the same page, being really upfront with them that there'll be a training once a year that you need to attend, and then that's kind of it. Like, just making sure that you're managing the expectations that they have, and also, making sure that you have a really good sense of how they're interpreting what it is that they think they're supposed to be doing. So keeping these volunteers engaged is really, really important. But I do want to just offer kind of a word of caution here about what we call volunteer fatigue, which is a concept that has been emerging within the disaster volunteer space more broadly across the US for the past 5 or 6 years at this point. So one of the challenges that we're having is that as we see this increase in disasters, increase in risk across the country, we are starting to see some volunteer fatigue among our national disaster nonprofits in terms of them being able to have enough volunteers to send to communities across the country that are experiencing disasters. Essentially, disasters are happening so frequently across the country that, they don't necessarily capture media attention in the way that they did 10, 20 years ago. And the kind of volunteering around that is in flux a bit more than it has in the past. And so, again, if you are at an institution where you are experiencing regular disasters in your community, it's something to just be aware of, that you want to be really kind of cautious about how you're managing those volunteers in terms of how often they're being called on to assist and kind of where they're at in terms of their ability to repeatedly be involved in a response or a recovery from an event. So there definitely is kind of this like fine balance between giving them enough to do and not giving them too much to do. And then, of course, any kind of like volunteer appreciation usually can help with retainment efforts. So the last thing I just wanted to touch in really quickly is this issue of getting buy-in. So again, there's, I think, a lot of kind of perceptions about volunteers and their usefulness and the challenges that can be associated with them. So some of you who maybe really want to use volunteers may be running into a lack of institutional support to do so. I would definitely approach this in terms of kind of going through this self-analysis that we talked about, kind of finding where there are needs within your institution that others haven't been able to come up with a solution for, and offering this idea that potentially there is room to use these volunteers in that way. I would also caution here, managing expectations. So again, definitely dream big fan of doing that in terms of how you might be able to use volunteers within your institution, but I definitely recommend starting small. You can have a really big vision for how, 5 years from now, you're going to use volunteers for all of these different things, but starting off small and kind of building that, working out issues, getting that buy-in over time from other parts of your institution will really help kind of build that support that you need to use volunteers in the long term. Of course, there's definitely risks associated with using volunteers. People are very often concerned with things like liability. Again, it kind of depends on your institution. It's something to be aware of and make sure that you are kind of factoring into any volunteer plans that you're making. I would also say that, I think there's kind of some hidden benefits of using volunteers. You are potentially opening the doors for a kind of better connection with your local community. I think we talk, or I've spoken here about how volunteers can be used to help you and your institution. But if you're in a community that has experienced a disaster, there are going to be a lot of people in your community who need help. And I think that kind of looking at how your institution could help your broader community, maybe you don't necessarily have a need for your volunteers when that disaster is happening. Maybe you can go send your volunteer to go help open a shelter or something, so that your institution is being represented out in your community and your volunteers are still helping. So I think there are some kind of like mutual benefits for your community as a whole, through taking this more volunteer-based approach to thinking about disasters. So happy to answer questions now. I'm also on Twitter and I have a link to my website there. If you think of other questions later, feel free to reach out. Yes, do we want to do questions now?
Yes, that would be great. And hopefully people can hear me okay. And thank you so much, Samantha. Great presentation. But just, yes, a little apology to the audience. I know apparently my internet decided that it didn't want to support a Zoom webinar today. So apologies for the technical issues at the front end, but you were loud and clear for the majority of it. But just apologies to everybody. If it happens again, I'm just going to shut my video off. All right, so technical issues aside, I'd love to ask you some questions. And this one's kind of an easy one that we've received. Can you recommend resources where our attendees could explore and learn kind of the nuts and bolts of organizing and coordinating volunteers, kind of that operational side of things?
Yeah, you know what? This is one of the areas that's lacking within the disasters. So I don't have a specific like book or anything in the like disaster context. There are a couple out there. If you just Google though for like regular volunteer management, you can take those same principles and just apply them in the disaster context, like apply them to each of those phases that I talked about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Gotcha. Okay. Let's see. Oh, here's one for you. Okay, so I'll read the whole, it's a comment and a question. So thank you for this presentation. Your comment at the end about the volunteers, your comment at the end about the volunteers being impacted by the disaster and having other pressing needs. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions for building a volunteer base outside of your local community? I'm assuming, in the case that that should happen.
Yeah, I think this is super smart. So if you have the resources to do that, that's really great. Even if you partnered with like another institution somewhere else in the country and kind of act as each other's backup in terms of volunteers. We are seeing an emergence of like online volunteers also within the disaster space. So depending on what your needs are, that's another way to think about using volunteers is, people don't even need to necessarily physically be in your town to participate or to be useful. And in fact, having those people outside the community can be really important in terms of one, whether people can physically kind of get to where you are, but then also if they're just overwhelmed with their own needs from the disaster and maybe aren't able to volunteer.
Gotcha. Thank you. Let's see. Okay, next question. This is tricky. How do you think through balancing paying for support and using volunteers?
Yeah. Well, I think if you have the resources to pay for support, then that's great. And you should probably do that. But I do also think that, there are benefits to using volunteers, even if you do have those resources. I think when we're talking about the people who are willing to volunteer, particularly before a disaster has happened, these are usually very passionate people. They probably have some kind of like personal buy-in to wanting to participate in this. And I think it kind of almost makes them more likely to show up. And I think, again, it kind of comes back to what your needs are. I think for things that I think it's also not bad to have some redundancy there. So having people who are paid and having those volunteers almost as backup, or kind of an extra set of hands is useful. But I wouldn't shy away from using volunteers for kind of these really important tasks for your institutions. When you look at the disaster research, there are very, very few examples of volunteers actually being a liability. They are almost always a benefit. And so it's not, not necessarily as scary as it might kind of sound.
Fears might be a little unfounded. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. Next question. Do you recommend having disaster drills as a volunteer engagement activity, or do you have any other suggestions for engagement activities?
Yeah, I think disaster drills are great. That's good for your like institution as a whole, right? To be doing those disaster drills, and any opportunity to bring those volunteers in is great. I think that's also helpful for your institution to have like other people involved who may spot something that you're missing along the way. So that's definitely a great activity. Incorporating volunteers into planning kind of for the same reason is really helpful. I could imagine doing some like education events even where you are kind of reviewing a recent disaster that has happened and how local cultural institutions were affected, just as kind of again, an excuse to bring those volunteers together and keep them engaged, but also to have that educational piece. Having them help with, any kind of like planning that you're doing in terms of like stockpiling supplies or that type of work. Certainly using volunteers for that is common.
Mm-hmm. No, makes sense. Makes sense. Let's see. Oh, here we go. All right, next question. Could you talk about the non-traditional partners or sources of information in addition to FEMA or other emergency management agencies?
Sure. I mean, I really think the kind of obvious one here is other nonprofits in your community. I think this is another place where kind of your institution being a resource to the community during a disaster, there's some potential there if you have, a large conference room or something in your building that you're not using, and you have a nonprofit in your community that their building flooded and they're displaced. Being able to lend them your space while they figure their situation out. So really any kind of partnerships that you're forming among those other nonprofits. One thing specifically to look into, which are sometimes associated with emergency management agencies, but are also sometimes independent, are what are called local VOADs, local voluntary organizations active in disasters. So usually if you type in your city's name or like your county's name and VOAD, VOAD, you should be able to find if there's a group near you. And those are just usually groups where lots of different nonprofits who expect to be involved in a disaster come together. They usually meet a couple times a year to talk through what their plans are, share resources, etc. So a group like that would be great to have cultural institutions that be a part of those types of groups.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that one of our organizations in the Heritage Emergency National Task Force has been working heavily and I think has achieved VOED status. it's not my program, so I don't want to get misspeak about it, but the Foundation for the American Institute in Conservation has been working a lot on that. And actually, to build on that, Samantha, out of curiosity, as far as getting started, do you think it's wiser to kind of go down those kind of established volunteer resources that are already kind of integrated into the emergency management structure when you're thinking about crafting your volunteer plans? Or do you think you should maybe stick to your like the volunteers that like the volunteers that are just tied to like your institution?
Yeah, so you're getting at this question of like internal versus external. So I think
Mm-hmm.
there's benefit to doing both. So if you're just going to use your kind of day-to-day volunteers in this new disaster context, then I think kind of sticking things out internally, and you probably already have a management system in place that you can just use. Like, don't reinvent the wheel. We know things go better during a disasters if you're using your kind of existing day-to-day systems as much as possible. So that is a good kind of approach if you already have that kind of internal volunteer infrastructure. I think if you're completely new to using volunteers and your like first foray into doing that is in this disaster context, then it could be useful to kind of go to some other meetings, see how other institutions are using volunteers, kind of what the layout of disaster volunteers looks like in your particular community. So you can kind of incorporate that into how you're designing your program. So again, it kind of just depends on how many resources you have to put into it.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a tough choice. A lot of, a lot of proing and conning and a lot of unfortunate kind of disaster hypotheticals, thinking about, well, all
Yeah.
right, if something was to happen to the institution, what would the ideal volunteer response be? And then maybe working back from there. Okay, so I'm just checking to make sure that I'm being a good moderator and not overlooking any questions.
While you do that, I will
Mhm.
say that probably the like overarching piece of advice that I have here is to be really flexible in any context. You cannot plan for everything when it comes to disasters. You can plan, do your best to plan as much as you can, but very often when a disaster happens, this is true with volunteers, it's also true with government and everybody else, very often those plans get thrown out the window because they don't match up with what is happening. Things aren't going the way that you envision them going. And very often that can be almost panic inducing, and it can feel like there's been this big failure. And sometimes that's true, but very often this is the nature of disaster, and it is 100% okay to improvise during disasters. Ideally, you don't have to, but it is okay to say there is this need happening within our institution that we didn't plan for correctly. It's happening now. You have to deal with it, right? That's the nature of disaster. And so that kind of that need to improvise can have this really negative connotation with it. But actually in emergency management, it happens constantly. It's one of the ways that we know a disaster is occurring, is that we see that improvisation happen. And so for that to happen with your volunteers is not necessarily a bad thing at all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And I guess one last question, and this is actually just from me. Do you have kind of like a shining example of how volunteers have been used in the disasters that you've studied? Or is there just like one great case study that you would love to be able to do more research on regarding volunteers in a disaster?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, oh gosh, how to pick one. I mean, there's a million examples. So one of my kind of favorite examples, and speaks to this issue of improvisation too. I was in Houston, Texas during the 2016 tax day flood, which I always say is two floods before Harvey in Houston. And it was a really bad flood. It didn't capture as much national media attention as it really should have. And I was in Houston. I was doing quick response research. So as the flood was happening, and one of the places I was embedded at was the large community shelter that had been opened up in Houston. And I got there and I was kind of expecting to see kind of those national disaster nonprofits that usually have their volunteers in these big stadium shelters. And I got there and there was like one person from one of those organizations there. And so I was walking around trying to figure out, I was there to interview volunteers. So I was trying to figure out who was in charge. And long story short, I came to find out that the shelter had never formally been opened, which is another issue. But what had happened is that the maintenance guy who ran the high school sports arena saw that the neighborhood was flooding and went over to open the doors. They had used this building as a shelter in previous floods. And he went over and just opened the doors, and people showed up, and they went and found the old cots that were stored in the back room, set them up. They started signing themselves in. Eventually, other volunteers, other people from the neighborhood, from the community, started just showing up. They're what we call spontaneous volunteers, and they created their own plan for how they were going to run the shelter, kind of regardless of any pre-existing plans that had existed. And so I think that's a really great example of how there is this formal emergency management, right? These like formal programs, this formal policy, government involvement that happens. But at the end of the day, it's regular people who are just showing up to help that end up doing the vast majority of the work, and sometimes do it much better than what we could have ever even planned for in the first place.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good thing to keep in mind as we close out today's session. It's people on the ground doing the best they can with what they have. Now, very, very good to remind ourselves. So thank you. This hour, despite the technical difficulties, is again flown by for me. So I'm going to begin my closing remarks. So round of virtual applause. Thank you, Dr. Montano, for taking time to present during our Heart Week. Thank you. Thank you. And we hope to continue the conversation as we move forward. And thank you to all of our attendees for coming to today's session. We plan on putting a recording of this webinar, hopefully sans too much technical difficulties, onto the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative's YouTube channel. Be on the lookout for that in the new year. Heart Week doesn't stop here. The next session is tomorrow. Well, I can plug it and then people can read it. So yes, tomorrow, again at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we will be welcoming Marta Mabel Perez, who is director of the Museo de Arte de Puerto Rico. Her talk is titled "The Museo de Arte de Puerto Rico to the Rescue of the Artistic and Cultural Heritage of Puerto Rico." Just as a kind of anecdote, the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative and the Heritage Emergency National Task Force worked very closely with Marta Mabel after the devastating hurricane season of Irma and Maria, and we learned a lot and were able to implement a lot of great programs down there. And I know Marta is not only going to speak about those programs, but also how the museum continued to recover and actually respond to the other disasters that unfortunately happened in the area. So looking forward to seeing you all there tomorrow. Again, if you would like to register for any of our remaining programs, please go to our website. I believe the link has been dropped in the chat. All of the webinars listed there are open to the public. You just need to register. So thanks again, everybody, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.